All right, which spectacular American city skyline do you prefer? San Francisco, right behind me, or New York City? I'm about to board a plane out there for 49ers Giants. Great rivalry of the 1980s. I'd say a good rivalry between the cities. Similar in one way, very, very different than others. Why don't we talk about the 49ers defensive line, though? Because, this game comes at such a fascinating time, right ahead of the trade deadline. And the 49ers put together one of the most fascinating weeks that I've seen ahead of a trade deadline, because they entered it completely desperate along the defensive line. We saw them against Houston last week. Well, since then, they have added a defensive lineman via trade. That's Keon White. They've added a defensive lineman via free agent signing. That's Cleveland Farrell. They have returned somebody who's at the very top of the league rankings in interior win rate to practice. That's Yetur Gross-Matos. I expect Yetur to be out on the field for the 49ers on Sunday. And they've received good injury news on the three defensive linemen who were hurt in their game against the Houston Texans: Sam Okawanu, Jordan Elliott, and Alfred Collins. So just an outpouring of good news for the 49ers defensive line. I know that may sound foreign to 49ers fans, but it did indeed happen this week. Does that change the calculus for them as far as the trade deadline goes? Because we had figured that they really, really need another pass rusher. I think they're definitely interested in another pass rusher. We could joke all we want about heading to New York and coming back with either Kayvon Thibodeau or Will Anderson IV on the plane. But as much as that was a joke, I thought that it was a very pronounced need for the 49ers. We listened to John Lynch talk on KMBR on Thursday. He seemed oddly confident about the 49ers D-line moving forward. And maybe the Yetur Gross-Matos return and some of the good news that the 49ers got this week made him that way. Now, you'll notice that John Lynch talks very often about the return of Bryce Huff. I think everything that the 49ers are doing is contingent on that. Because, Bryce, he's like Nick Bosa for this team now. He's not as good as Nick Bosa, but he's had to fill into that role. If there's one spot where the 49ers are deficient right now, because they've got so many of these big pass rushers, guys that can line up on the outside and then rush against the interior, 270 to up to 285 pounds in the case of Keon White. They might be deficient in the pure edge rusher sense. When you look at somebody like a Bryce Huff, who's in the 240s, who can just roar around the edge and deliver a speed rushing complement to the Bosa position. Since Huff is now in the Bosa position, do they have a bookend for Bryce Huff in these pure pass rushing packages? That's where I think that Will McDonald might fit for the 49ers. Somebody like Robert Beal Jr. has the physical characteristics for that job, but he hasn't yet put together the success that the 49ers would need to see to be confident at that edge rusher position. So that's where I think the 49ers still enter this trade deadline with a deficiency, but we've got to watch what happens this week across the entire NFL. Obviously somebody like Trey Hendrickson, he's a complete player. So much respect for Trey Hendrickson in that 49ers locker room. I actually thought it was awesome just talking to some guys about Trey this week, and he does everything the right way. He would give you star power, NFL sack leader presence. But we don't even know if the Bengals will change their minds about wanting to sell there. I think that it makes too much sense. I think that they absolutely should consider it, but you can't count on it. You could look at somebody like Will Anderson from the Jets. That's probably more likely. You could look at the guys from the Miami Dolphins, and with the Dolphins struggling the way that they are this year, Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips. Yeah, you could also see some three-down players on the other edge. I think that when you appraise the 49ers situation right now, though, you have to project forward. Like, what is this defensive line going to look like, not just in 2025, but also in 2026 and beyond? And they're projecting to get Nick Bosa back. So whoever they add this year, they want to make sure can fit within the larger scale plans of the 3-year window of the D-line. And that's why I look at somebody like Will McDonald and I say, okay, that can fit. He's under contract. Trey Hendrickson, you would never say no to. I think that would be the one exception that you would make as far as a rental goes, because he's not under contract beyond this season. You could figure stuff out past 2025 as long as you get the benefit of his services this year. But it is a complicated process for the 49ers, balancing 2025, 2026, and beyond. And I think that Keon White really fit the 49ers needs at defensive line in those ways, but other players may not, and other players may not be available for San Francisco. And it's totally possible that some unheralded names pop up this weekend that we weren't expecting, like McKinley Jackson. He's a defensive tackle for the Bengals. He's a 2024 third-round draft pick. He requested a trade or release from Cincinnati. Obviously, things aren't going swimmingly well in Cincinnati. Trey Hendrickson doesn't seem to want to play there. McKinley Jackson doesn't want to seem to play there. Miles Murphy, the defensive end, we'll see if he's somebody that's interested in being in Cincinnati. The Bengals could just stand firm and say, we're not trading anybody. I think it would be foolish. I think they do need to move on with their lives, being one of the worst defenses in football, and obviously not being Super Bowl contenders with where they are on the efficiency graphs this year. But if the Bengals decide to play ball after this weekend, if this was just all posturing, saying that they're not going to do anything, you look in that direction if you're the 49ers. You can still try to find ways to improve your football team in a creative, efficient fashion. And somebody like McKinley Jackson, I think the 49ers, they're in a position where anywhere on the defensive line is open for competition. That was the spirit of this whole offseason for San Francisco, right? They let go of some of the veterans who were dead-end veterans they saw, like Javon Hargrave and Leonard Floyd, who weren't particularly good against the run. They needed to improve against the run. They have. They brought in that youthful hunger. They fostered competition. But now they find themselves in a situation where the run defense has improved. The hunger and the youth and all those markers of the team are in a much better spot than they were before. But they need a little bit more of that pass rushing juice, and they may need to pick up some of that injury slack, although the past week has changed some of those dynamics. So I can't wait to watch this over the course of this weekend. One of the main things to keep in mind is that perhaps the biggest indicator of what the 49ers will have to do ahead of November 4th will come from the 49ers themselves, not from these other teams. Like, how is Yetur Gross-Matos going to perform against the New York Giants defensive line? How's he going to work within the context of the 49ers' larger defensive line? Is he going to give them that 23% pressure win rate boost and make everybody around him better? Is Keon White, who I think is a very similar player to Yetur, and it's funny because Keon's under contract through 2026. This is Yetur's final year under contract. Is he going to provide a nice outside-in complement, and could they use both Yetur Gross-Matos and Keon White interchangeably and throw the Giants' offensive line, which is ranked in the middle of the pack, into a blender? Where does Sam Okawanu fit into all this? Mykel Williams, I know that you love him setting the edge on rundowns. Can you now move him in more frequently to the inside with the new setup that they're going to have with some more bodies? And, Clelin Ferrell could also be somebody that anchors the outside and lets Mykel Williams move inside, where he's seen much more pass rushing success this season. So it's all an entire ecosystem, a defensive line, right? You can't just look at this in simplistic terms. You have to and say, oh, this is only one player like Keon White, who hasn't done much this year. There's no way he can help the 49ers. If he can just nudge one guy into a different spot, and that creates a domino effect of more productivity, better cohesion along the line, that can make the entire defensive line better. That's how you have to think of this. The 49ers hope that Keon White is going to give them that little nudge that turns into the domino effect that makes the line better elsewhere. And I think that you could have a lot of different nudge points now, since you also are getting Yetur Gross-Matos back, since Clelin Ferrell, who set such a good edge for this team back in 2023, is going to be there. I mean, they really missed Clelin Ferrell after he got hurt in Week 18 in the postseason. This really will be a fascinating case study. And it's just too bad that 49ers defensive line can't go up against Cam Skattebo, because that would be a really nice test, right? Former 49ers fan, Cam Skattebo, suffered an injury very similar to Fred Warner's last week against the Eagles. So he won't be able to run against the 49ers. But these guys still have to corral Jackson Dart. He's going to run around a lot. I mean, it really does set this up really nicely for that experiment. How does this 49ers defensive line with these guys coming back work? And will they need to add somebody else before November 4th, or will they maintain trade leverage? Because I think the direction it's heading in now, with the good news of this week, the 49ers do have some leverage heading into November 4th to where they're not completely desperate. And just a few days ago, they were desperate. A few days ago against the Houston Texans, it was bad, but they have returned some guys. They have made a trade. We said they would have to make a trade. They did. And now we'll see how this new collection of defensive linemen will work together against the Giants over on the East Coast, not here on the West Coast, in New Jersey, not exactly in New York, but we're going to get to see how that works. Maybe it will be a thing of beauty for the 49ers. I will say, though, that New York will never be as beautiful as San Francisco. I mean, here you've got obviously the skyline, you have Coit Tower, Transamerica Pyramid, and then look, you also have the cable cars. When we talked about the trade of Keon White the other day, cable cars were one of our metaphors. 49ers defense on its way up. We'll talk to you guys soon.